Chapter 35. Elizabeth woke the next morning to the same thoughts and meditations which had at length closed her eyes. She could not yet recover from the surprise at what had happened. It was impossible to think of anything else, and, totally indisposed for employment, she resolved, soon after breakfast, to indulge herself in air and exercise. She was proceeding directly to her favorite walk when the recollection of Mr. Darcy's sometimes coming there stopped her, and instead of entering the park, she turned up the lane, which led further from the turnpike road. The park paling was still the boundary on one side, and soon she passed one of the gates into the ground. After walking 2 or 3 times along that part of the lane, she was tempted by the pleasantness of the morning to stop at the gates and look into the park. The 5 weeks which she had now passed in Kent had made a great difference in the country, and every day was adding to the verdure of the early trees. She was on the point of continuing her walk when she caught a glimpse of a gentleman within the sort of grove which edged the park. He was moving that way, and, fearful of it being Mr. Darcy, she was directly retreating. But the person who was advancing was now near enough to see her, and stepping forward with eagerness, pronounced her name. She had turned away, but on hearing herself called, though in a voice which proved it to be Mr. Darcy, she moved again towards the gate. He had by that time reached it also, and, holding out a letter, which she instinctively took, said with a look of haughty composure, "I have been walking in the grove for some time in the hope of meeting you. Will you do me the honor of reading that letter?" And then, with a slight bow, turned again into the plantation, and was soon out of sight. With no expectation of pleasure, but with the strongest curiosity, Elizabeth opened the letter, and, to her still increasing wonder, perceived an envelope containing 2 sheets of letter paper, written quite through in a very close hand. The envelope itself was likewise full. Pursuing her way along the lane, she then began it. It was dated from Rosings, at 8 o'clock in the morning, and it was as follows. "Be not alarmed, madam, on receiving this letter, by the apprehension of its containing any repetition of those sentiments, or renewal of those offers which were last night so disgusting to you. I write without any intention of paining you, or humbling myself, by dwelling on the wishes which, for the happiness of both, cannot be too soon forgotten, and the effort of which the formation and the perusal of this letter must occasion should have been spared, had not my character required it to be written and read. You must, therefore, pardon the freedom with which I demand your attention. Your feelings, I know, will bestow it unwillingly, but I demand it of your justice. 2 offenses of a very different nature, and by no means of equal magnitude, you last night laid to my charge. The first mention was, that, regardless of the sentiments of either, I had detached Mr. Bingley from your sister, and the other, that I had, in defiance of various claims, in defiance of honor and humility, ruined the immediate prosperity and blasted the prospects of Mr. Wickham. Wilfully and wantingly, to have thrown off the companion of my youth, the acknowledged favorite of my father, a young man who had scarcely any other dependence than on our patronage, and who had been brought up to accept extortion, which would be a depravity, to which the separation of 2 young persons whose affection could be the growth of only a few weeks could bear no comparison. But the severity of that blame, which was last night so liberally bestowed, expecting each circumstance, I shall hope to be in the second secured, when the following account of my actions and their motives has been read. If in examining of them, which is due to myself, I am under the necessity of relating feelings which may be offensive to yours. I can only say that I am sorry. The necessity must be obeyed, and further apology would be absurd. I had not been long in Hertfordshire before I saw in common with others that Bingley preferred your elder sister to any other young woman in the country. But it was not till the evening of the dance at Netherfield that I had any apprehension of his feelings of a serious attachment. I had often seen him in love before. At that ball, while I had the honor of dancing with you, I was first made acquainted by Sir William's accidental information that Bingley's attentions to your sister had given a rise to a general expectation of their marriage. He spoke of it as a certain event in which the time alone could be undecided. From that moment I observed my friend's behavior attentively, and I could then perceive that his partiality for Miss Bennet was beyond what I had ever witnessed in him. Your sister I also watched. Her looks and manners were open, cheerful, engaging as ever. But, without any symptom of this peculiar regard, I am remained convinced from that evening's scrutiny that though she received his attentions with pleasure, she did not invite them by any participation of sentiment. If you have not been mistaken here, I must have been in error. Your superior knowledge of your sister must make the latter probable. If it be so, if I have been misled by such an error to inflict pain on her, your resentment has not been unreasonable. And I've remained convinced, with pleasure, she did not invite them by any participation of sentiment. If you have not been mistaken here, I must have been in error. Your superior knowledge of your sister must make the latter probable. If it be so, if I have been misled by such an error to inflict pain on her, your resentment has not been unreasonable. But I shall not scruple to assert that the certainty of your sister's countenance and air was such as might have been given the most acute observer a conviction that, however admirable her anger, her heart was not likely to be touched. That I was desirous of believing her indifferent is certain, but I will venture to say that my investigation and decisions are not usually influenced by my hopes or fears. I did not believe her to be indifferent because I wished it. I believed it on impartial conviction, as I am truly as I wish it in reason. My objections to the marriage were not merely those which I last night acknowledged to have the utmost force of passion to put aside. In my own case, the want of connection could not be so great an evil to my friend as to me. But there were other causes of repugnance, causes which, though still existing and existing to an equal degree in both instances, I had myself endeavored to forget, because they were not immediately before me. These causes must be stated, though briefly. The situation of your mother's family, though objectable, was nothing in comparison to the total want of propriety so frequently, so almost ununiformly portrayed by herself, by your three younger sisters, and occasionally even by your father. Pardon me, it pains me to offend you, but amidst your concern for the defects of your nearest relations and your displeasure at this representation of them, let it give you consolation to consider to have conducted yourselves so as to avoid any of the share like censure is praise no less generally bestowed on you and your elder sister, that it is honorable in the sense and disposition of both. I will only say further from what passed that evening, my opinion of all parties was confirmed, and every inducement heightened which could have led before me to preserve my friend from what I esteem a most unhappy connection. He left Netherfield for London on the day following, as you, I am certain, remember, with the design of soon returning. The part which I acted is now to be explained. His sister's uneasiness had been equally excited with my own. Our conscience of feeling was soon discovered, and, alike sensible that no time was to be lost in detaching their brother, we shortly resolved on joining him directly in London. We accordingly went, and there I readily engaged in the office of pointing out to my friend the certain evils of such a choice. I described and enforced them earnestly. But, however this remonstrance might have staggered or delayed his determination, I do not suppose that it would ultimately have prevented the marriage, had it not seconded by the assurance that I hesitate in not giving of your sister's indifference. She had before believed her return to his affection with sincere, if not equal, regard. But Bingley has great natural modesty, which a stronger dependence on my judgment than his own. To convince him, therefore, he had deceived himself was no very difficult point. To persuade him against returning in the Hertfordshire, when that conviction had been given, was scarcely the work of a moment. I cannot blame myself for having done thus much. There is but one part of my conduct in the whole affair on which I do not reflect with satisfaction. It is that I condescended to adopt the measures of art so far as to conceal him from your sister's being in town. I knew it myself, as it was known to Miss Bingley, but her brother is even yet ignorant of it. They might have met without ill consequences, perhaps probable, but his regard did not make it appear to me enough extinguished for him to see her without some danger. Perhaps this concealment, this disguise was beneath me. It is done, however, and it was done for the best. On this subject I have nothing more to say, no other apology to offer. If I have wounded your sister's feelings, it was unknowingly done, and though the motives which govern me may offer you very naturally appear insufficient, I have not yet learned to condemn them. With respect to the other, more weighty accusation of having injured Mr. Wickham, I can only refute it by laying before you the whole of his connection with my family. Of what he has particularly accused me of, I am ignorant, but of the truth of what I shall relate, I can summon more than one witness of an undoubted veracity. Mr. Wickham is the son of a very respectable man, for who had many years the management of all the Primley estates, and whose good conduct in the discharge of his trust naturally inclined my father to be of service to him. And on George Wickham, who has his godson, his kindness was therefore liberally bestowed. My father supported him at a school and afterwards at Cambridge, most important assistance, as his own father, always poor from the extravagance of his wife, would have been unable to give him a gentleman's education. My father was not only fond of this young man's society, whose manner was always engaging, he had also the highest opinion of him, and hoping the church would be his profession, intended to provide for him in it. As for myself, it is many, many years since I first began to think of him in a very different manner. The vicious propensities, the want of principle, which he kept was careful to guard from knowledge of his best friend, could not escape the observation of a young man of nearly the same age with himself, and who had opportunities of seeing him in unguarded moments, which Mr. Darcy could not have. Here again shall give you pain to what degree only you can tell. But whatever may be the sentiments which Mr. Wickham has created, a suspension of their nature shall not prevent me from unfolding his real character. It adds even another motive. My excellent father died about 5 years ago, and his attachment to Mr. Wickham was to the last so steady that in his will he particularly recommended it to me to promote his advancement in the best manner that his profession might allow, and if he took orders, desired that valuable family living might be as soon as it became vacant. There was also a legacy of £1,000. His own father did not survive mine, and within half a year from these events, Mr. Wickham wrote me to inform me that, having finally resolved against taking orders, he hoped I should not think it unreasonable for him to expect some more immediate pecuniary advantage in lieu of the preferment, by which he could not be benefited. He had some intention, he added, of studying law, and I must be aware that the interest of £1,000 would be a very insufficient support therein. I rather wished than believed him to be sincere, but at any rate was perfectly ready to accede to his proposal. I knew that Mr. Wickham ought not to be a clergyman. The business was therefore soon settled. He resigned all claim to assistance in the church, where it was possible that he could ever be in a situation to receive it, and accepted in return £3,000. All connection between us seemed now disresolved. I thought of him too ill to invite him to Pemberley, or admit his society in town. In town, I believe he chiefly lived, but his studying the law was a mere pretense. And being now free from all restraint, his life was a way of idleness and dissipation. For about 3 years I heard little of him, but on the decree of the incumbent of the living which had been designed for him, he applied to me again by letter for the presentation. His circumstances, he assured me, and I had no difficulty in believing it, were exceedingly bad. He had found the law a most unprofitable study, and was now absolutely resolved on being ordained. I would present him to the living in question, of which he trusted there could be little doubt, as he was well assured that I had no other person to provide for, and I could not have forgotten my reverend father's intentions. You will hardly blame me for refusing to comply with this entreaty, or resisting every repetition to it. His resentment was in proportion to the distress of his circumstances, and he was doubtless as violent in his abuse to me as others as in the reproaches to myself. After this period, every appearance of acquaintance was dropped. How he lived I know not. But last summer he was again most painfully obtruded on my notice. I must now mention a circumstance which I wish to forget myself, and which no obligation less than the present should induce me to unfold to any human being. Having said thus much, I feel no doubt of your secrecy. My sister, who is more than 10 years my junior, was left to the guardianship of my brother's nephew, Colonel Fitzwilliam, and myself. About a year ago, she was taken from school, and an establishment formed for her in London. And this last summer she went with the lady who presided over it to Ramsgate, and thither also went Mr. Wickham, undoubtedly by design. For there proved to have been a prior acquaintance between him and Miss Young, in whose character we were most unhappily deceived. And by her connivance and aid, he so far recommended himself to Georgina, whose affectionate heart retained a strong impression of his kindness to her as a child, that she was persuaded to believe herself in love, and to consent to an elopement. She was then but 15, which must be her excuse, and after stating her imprudence, I am happy to add that I owed the knowledge of it to herself. I joined them unexpectedly a day or two before the intended elopement, and then Georgina, unable to support the idea of grieving and offending a brother whom she almost looked up to as a father, acknowledged the whole to me. You may imagine what I felt and how I acted. Regard my sister's credit and feelings prevented any public exposure. But I wrote to Mr. Wickham, who left the place immediately, and Mrs. Young was, of course, removed from her charge. Mr. Wickham's chief concern object was unquestionably my sister's fortune, which is 30,000 pounds, but I cannot help supposing that the hope of revenging himself on me was a strong inducement. His revenge would have been complete indeed. This, madam, is a faithful narrative of every event in which we have been concerned together. And if you do not absolutely reject it as false, you will, I hope, acquit me hereforth of cruelty towards Mr. Wickham. I know not in what manner, under what form of falsehood he had imposed on you, but his success is not perhaps to be wondered at. Ignorant as you previously were of everything concerning either, and suspicion certainly not in your inclination. You may possibly wonder why all of this was not told to you last night. But I was not then master enough of myself to know what could or ought to be revealed. For the truth of everything here related, I can appear more particularly to the testimony Colonel Fitzwilliam, who, with our near relation and constant intimacy, and still more, as one of executioners of my father's will, has been unavoidably acquainted with every particular of these transactions. If your appearance of me should make my assertions valueless, you cannot be prevented by the same cause of confiding in my cousin, and that there may be the possibility of consulting him. I may endure to find some opportunity of putting this letter in your hands in the course of the morning. I will only add, God bless you. Fitzwilliam Darcy. Chapter 36. If Elizabeth, when Mr. Darcy gave her the letter, did not expect it to contain a renewal of his offers, she had formed no expectation at all of its contents. But such as they were, it may well be supported how eagerly she went through them, and what a contrariety of emotion they excited. Her feelings, as she read, were scarcely to be defined. With amazement, she did first understand that he believed any apology to be in his power, and steadfastly she was persuaded that he could have no explanation to give, which a just sense of shame would not conceal. With a strong prejudice against everything he might say, she began his account of what had happened at Netherfield. She read with an eagerness which hardly left her power of comprehension, and from the impatience of knowing what the next sentence might bring, was incapable of attending to the sense of one before her eyes. His belief of her sister's instability she instantly resolved to be false, and his account of the worst objections to the match made her too angry to have any wish of him doing justice. He expressed no regret for what he had done, which satisfied her. His style was not primitive, but haughty. It was all pride and insolence. But when the subject was succeeded by his account of Mr. Wickham, when she read in somewhat clearer attention with the relation of events which, if true, must overthrow every cherished opinion of his worth, and which also bore so alarming an affinity to his own history of himself, her feelings were yet more acutely painful on the difficulty of definition. Astonishment, apprehension, and even horror opposed her. She wished to discredit it entirely, repeatedly exclaiming, "This must be false, this cannot be, this must be the grossest falsehood. And when she had gone through the whole of the letter, though scarcely knowing anything of the last page or two, put it hastily away, protesting she would not regard it, that she would never look at it again. In this perturbed state of mind, with thoughts that could rest on nothing, she walked on. But it would not do. In half a minute, the letter was unfolded again, and collecting herself as well as she could, she again began the mortifying perusal of all that related to Wickham, and command herself so far as to examine the meaning of every sentence. The account of his connection with the Pemberley family was exactly what he had related himself, and the kindness of the late Mr. Darcy, though she had not known before of its extent, agreed equally well with his own words. So far each recital confirmed the other, but when she came to the will, the difference was great. What Wickham had said of the living was fresh in her memory, and as she recalled his very words, it was impossible not to feel that there was gross duplicity on one side or the other, and for a few moments she flattered herself that her wishes did not err. But when she read and reread with the closest attention the peculiars immediately following of Wickham's resigning to all the pretensions to the living, of his receiving in lieu too considerable a sum of £3,000, again she was forced to hesitate. She put down the letter, weighed every circumstance with what she meant to be impartiality, deliberated on the probability of each statement, but with little success. On both sides it was only an assertion. Again she read on, but every line proved more clear that the affair, which she had believed it impossible that any other contrivance could so represent to render Mr. Darcy's conduct in it less than infamous, was capable of a turn which might make him entirely blameless throughout the whole. The extravagance and general profligacy which he scrupulated not to lay at Mr. Wickham's charge exceedingly shocked her, the more so as she could bring no proof of its injustice. She had never heard of him before his entrance into the shire. Militia in which he had engaged at the persuasion of the young man who, on meeting him accidentally in town, had there been a renewed a slight acquaintance. On his former way of life nothing had known in Hertfordshire but what he had told himself. As to his real character, had information been in her power, she had never felt a wish of inquiring. His countenance, voice, and manner had established him at once in the possession of every virtue. She tried to recollect some instances of goodness, some distinguished trait of integrity or benevolence, that might rescue him from the attacks of Mr. Darcy, or at least, by the predominance of virtue, atone for those casual errors under which she might endure to class what Mr. Darcy had described as the idleness and vice of many years' continuance. But no recollection befriended her. She could see him instantly before her in every charm of air and address, but she could not remember no substantial good than the general approbation of neighborhood, and the regard which his social powers had gained him in the mess. After pausing on this point with a considerable while, she once more continued the read. But alas, the story which followed of his designs on Miss Darcy received some confirmation from what had passed between Colonel Fitzwilliam and herself only the morning before. And at last she was referred for the truth of every particular to Colonel Fitzwilliam himself, from whom she had previously received the information of his near concern in all of his cousin's affairs, and whose character she had no reason to question. At one time she had almost resolved on applying to him, but the idea was checked by the awkwardness of the application, and at length wholly banished by the conviction that Mr. Darcy would never have hazarded such a proposal, and if he had not been well assured of his cousin's corroboration. She perfectly remembered everything that had passed in conversation between Wickham and herself in their first meeting at Mr. Phelps'. Many of his expressions were still afresh in her memory, which was now struck with the impropriety of such communications to a stranger, and wondered it had escaped her before. She saw the indelicacy of putting herself forward as he had done, and the inconsistencies of his professions with his conduct. She remembered that he had boasted of having no fear of seeing Mr. Darcy, that Mr. Darcy might leave the country, but that he should stand his ground. Yet he had avoided Netherfield Ball the very next week. She remembered that, till the Netherfield family had quitted the country, he had told his story to no one but to herself. But after that removal, it had been everywhere discussed, and he had then no reserves, no scruples in sinking Mr. Darcy's character, though he had assured her that respect for the father would always prevent his exposing the son. How differently did everything now appear in which he was concerned. His attentions to Miss King were now the conscience of his views, solely and hatefully mercenary, and the mediocrity of her fortune proved no longer the modification of his wishes, but his eagerness to grasp at anything. His behavior to herself could now have had no tolerable motive. He had either been deceived with regard to her fortune, or had been gratified by his vanity by encouraging the preference which she believed she had almost incautiously shown. Every lingering struggle in his favor grew fainter and fainter, and further in justification of Mr. Darcy, she could not but allow Mr. Bingley, when questioned by Jane, who had long ago asserted his blamelessness in the affair, that proved and repulsed as his manners. She had never, in the whole course of their acquaintanceship, an acquaintanceship which had latterly brought them much together and given her a sort of intimacy with his ways, seen anything that betrayed him to be unprincipled or unjust, anything that spoke of him ill-rigorously or morally habits, that among his own connections he was esteemed and valued, and that Wickham had allowed him merit as a brother, and that she had often heard him speak so affectionate of his sister as to prove him capable of some amicable feeling. That had his actions been what Mr. Wickham represented them, a gross violation of everything right could hardly have been concealed from the world, and that a friendship between a person capable of it, and a such amicable man as Mr. Bingley, was incomprehensible. She grew absolutely ashamed of herself. Of neither Darcy nor Wickham could she think without feeling she had been blind, partial, prejudiced, absurd. "How despicably I have acted," she cried. "I, who have prided myself in my discernment, I, who have valued myself on my abilities, who have often disdained the generous candor of my sister, and gratified my vanity in useless or blamable mistrust. How humiliating is this discovery! Yet how just a humiliation! Had I been in love, I could not have been more wretchedly blind. But vanity, not love, has been my folly. Pleased with the preference of one, and offended by the neglect of the other, on the very beginning of our acquaintanceship, I have courted prepossession and ignorance and driven reason away where neither were concerned. Till this moment, I never knew myself." From herself to Jane, from Jane to Bingley, her thoughts were in a line which soon brought to her recollection that Mr. Darcy's explanation there had apparently very insufficient, and she read it again. Widely different was the effect of a second perusal. How often she denied that credit to his assertions in one instance which she had been obliged to give in the other. He declared himself to be totally unsuspicious of her sister's attachment, and she could not help remembering what Charlotte's opinion had always been. Neither could she deny the justice of his description of Jane. She felt that Jane's feelings, though fervent, were little displayed, and that there was a constant complacency in her air and manner not often united with great sensibility. When she came to that part of the letter in which her family were mentioned in terms of such mortifying yet merited reproach, her sense of shame was severe. The justice of the charge struck her too forcibly for denial, and the circumstances to which he particularly alluded having passed at the Netherfield ball, as confirming all of his first disapprobation, could not have made a stronger impression on his mind than on hers. The compliment to herself and her sister was not unfelt. It soothed, but it could not console her for the contempt on which had thus been self-attracted by the rest of her family. And as she considered that Jane's disappointment had, in fact, been the work of her nearest relations, and reflected how materially the credit of both must be hurt in such impropriety of conduct, she felt depressed beyond anything she had ever known before. After wandering along the lane for 2 hours, giving way to every variety of thought, reconsidering events, determining probabilities, and recollecting herself as well as she could to a change so sudden and so important, fatigue and a recollection of her long absence made her at length return home, and as she entered the house with the wish of appearing cheerful as usual, the resolution of repressing such reflections as must make her unfit for conversation. She was immediately told that the 2 gentlemen from Roseling's had called during her absence. Mr. Darcy, only for a few minutes to take leave, but that Colonel Fitzwilliam had been sitting with them at least an hour, hoping for her return, and almost resolving to walk after her till she could be found. Elizabeth could but just affect concern in missing him. She really rejoiced at it. Colonel Fitzwilliam was no longer an object. She could only think of her letter. Chapter 37. The 2 gentlemen left Rosings the next morning, and Mr. Collins, having been in waiting near the lodges to make them his parting obeisance, was able to bring home the pleasing intelligence of their appearing in very good health, and as in intolerable spirits as could be expected after the melancholy scene so lately gone through at Rosings. To Rosings he hastened to console Lady Catherine and her daughter, and on his return brought back with great satisfaction a message from her ladyship, importing that she felt herself so dull as to make her very desirous of having them all dine with her. Elizabeth could not see Lady Catherine without recollecting that, had she chosen it, she might by this time have been presented to her as her future niece, nor could she think, without a smile, of what her lady's indignation would have been. What would she have said? How would she have behaved? Were questions with she amused herself. Their first subject was the diminution of Rosings' party. "I assure you I feel it exceedingly," said Lady Catherine. "I do believe no one feels the loss of friends so much as I do. But I am particularly attached to these men, and know them to be so much attached to me. They were exceedingly sorry to go, but so they always are. The dear Colonel rallied his spirits tolerably till just at last, but Darcy seemed to feel it most acutely, more, I think, than last year. His attachment to Rosings certainly increases." Mr. Collins had a compliment and an allusion to throw in here, which were kindly smiled on by the mother and daughter. Lady Catherine observed, after dinner, that Mrs. Bennet seemed out of spirits, and immediately accounting for it herself by supposing that she did not like to go home again so soon, she added, "But if that is the case, you must write to your mother and beg that you may stay a little longer. Mrs. Collins will be very glad of your company, I am sure. I am much obliged to your ladyship for your kind invitation, replied Elizabeth, but it is not in my power to accept it. I must be in town next Saturday. Why, at any rate, you will have been here only 6 weeks. I expected you to stay 2 months. I told Mr. Collins before you came there can be no occasion for your going so soon. Mrs. Bennet could certainly spare you another fortnight, but my father cannot. He wrote me last week to hurry my return. Oh, your father, of course, may spare you if your mother can. Daughters are never so much consequence to a father. And if you will stay another month complete, it will be in my power to take one of you as far as London, for I am going there early in June for a week. And as Dawson does not object to the Baroque box, there will be very good room for one of you. And indeed, if the weather should happen to be cool, I could not object to taking you both, as you are neither of you large. You are all kindness, madam, but I believe we must abide by our original plan. Lady Catherine seemed resigned. Mrs. Collins, you must send a servant with them. You know I always speak my mind, and I cannot bear the idea of 2 young women traveling post by themselves. It is highly improper. You must contrive to send somebody. I have the greatest dislike in the world to that sort of thing. Young women should always be properly guarded and attended according to their situation in life. When my niece, Georgina, went to Ramsgate last summer, I made a point of having her 2 men servants go with her. Miss Darcy, the daughter of Mr. Darcy of Pemberley and Lady Anne, could not have appeared with propriety in a different manner. I am exceedingly attentive to all those things. You must send John with the young ladies, Mrs. Collins. I am glad it occurred to me to mention it, for it would be really discreditable to you to let them go alone. My uncle is to send a servant for us. Oh, your uncle. He keeps a manservant, does he? I am very glad you have someone who thinks of these things. Where shall you change horses? Oh, Bromley, of course. If you mention my name at the bell, you will be attended to. Lady Catherine had many other questions to ask respecting their journey, and as she did not answer them all herself, attention was necessary, which Elizabeth believed to be lucky for her, or with a mind so occupied might have forgotten where she was. Reflection must be reserved for solitary hours. Whenever she was alone, she gave way to it as the greatest relief, and not a day went by without a solitary walk in which she might indulge all the delight of unpleasant recollections. Mr. Darcy's letter she was in a fair way of soon knowing by heart. She studied every sentence, and her feelings towards its writer were at times widely different. When she remembered the style of his address, she was still full of indignation. But when she considered how unjustly she had condemned and upbraided him, her anger was turned against herself, and his disappointed feelings became the object of compassion. His attachment excited gratitude, his general character respect, but she could not approve him, nor could she for a moment repent her refusal or feel the slightest inclination ever to see him again. In her own past behavior, there was a constant source of vexation and regret, and in the unhappy defects of her family, a subject of yet heavier chagrin. They were hopeless of remedy. Her father contended with laughing at them and would never exert himself to restrain the wild giddiness of his youngest daughters, and her mother, with manners so far right of herself, was entirely insensible of the evil. Elizabeth had frequently united with Jane in an endeavor to check on the imprudence of Catherine and Lydia. But while they were supported by their mother's indulgence, what chance could there be of improvement? Catherine, weak-spirited, irritable, and completely under Lydia's guidance, had always affronted by their advice, and Lydia, self-willed and careless, could scarcely give them a hearing. They were ignorant, idle, and vain. While there was an officer in Merrington, they would flirt with him. And while in Merrington was within a walk of Longbourn, they would be going there forever. Anxiety on Jane's behalf was another prevailing concern, and Mr. Darcy's explanation by restoring Bingley to all her former good opinion heightened the sense of what Jane had lost. His affection was proved to have been sincere, and his conduct cleared of all blame, unless any could detach to the implicitness of his confidence in his friend. How grievous then was the thought that, of a situation so desirable in every respect, so replete with advantage, so promising for happiness, Jane had been deprived by the folly and decorum of her own family. When to these recollections was added the development of Wickham's character, it may be easily believed that the happy spirits which had seldom been depressed before were now so much affected as to make it almost impossible for her to appear tolerably cheerful. Their engagements at Rosings were as frequent during the last week of her stay as they had been at first. The very last evening was spent there, and her ladyship again inquired minutely into the particulars of their journey, gave them directions as to the best method of packing, and was so urgent on the necessity of placing gowns in only the right way that Maria thought herself obliged, on her return, to undo all the work of the morning and pack her trunk afresh. When they all parted, Lady Catherine, with great condescension, wished them a good journey, and invited them to come to Hunsford again next year, and Miss de Bourgh exerted herself so far as to curtsy and hold out her hand to both. Chapter 38. On Saturday morning, Elizabeth and Mr. Collins met for breakfast a few minutes before the others appeared, and he took the opportunity of paying the parting civilities which he deemed indispensably necessary. "I know not, Miss Elizabeth," he said, "whether Miss Collins has yet expressed her sense of your kindness in coming to us, but I am very certain that you will not leave the house without receiving her thanks for it. The favor of your company has been much felt, I assure you. We know how little there is to tempt anyone to our humble abode. Our plain manner of living, our small rooms and few domestics, and the little we see of the world must make Hunsford extremely dull to a young lady like yourself. But I hope you will believe us grateful for the condescension, and that we will have done everything in our power to prevent your spending your time unpleasantly." Elizabeth was eager with her thanks and assurances of happiness. She had spent 6 weeks with great enjoyment, in the pleasure of being with Charlotte, and the great attentions she had received must make her feel the obliged. Mr. Collins was gratified, and with a more smiling solemnity replied, "It gives me great pleasure to hear that you have passed your time not disagreeably." "We have certainly done our best, and most fortunate having it in our power to introduce you to very superior society, and from our connections of Rosings, and the frequent means of varying the humble home scene, I think we flatter ourselves that your Hunsford visit cannot have been entirely irksome. Our situation with regard to Lady Catherine's family is indeed the sort of extraordinary advantage and blessing which few can boast. You see on what a footing we are. You see how continually we are engaged there. In truth, I must acknowledge that, with all the disadvantages of this humble parsonage, I should not think anyone abiding in it as an objection of compassion, while they are shares of our intimacy at Rosings." Words were inefficient for the elevation of his feelings, and he was obliged to walk about the room, while Elizabeth tried to unite civility and truth in a few short sentences. "You may, in fact, carry a very favorable report of us into Hertfordshire, my dear cousin. I flatter myself, at least, that you will be able to do so." Lady Catherine's great attentions to Mrs. Collins you have been a daily witness of, and altogether I trust it does not appear that your friend has drawn an unfortune. But on this point it will be well to be silent. Only let me assure you, my dear Elizabeth, that I can from my heart most cordially wish you equal felicity in marriage. My dear Charlotte and I have but one mind and one way of thinking. There is everything and a most remarkable resemblance of character and ideas between us. We seem to have been designed for each other. Elizabeth could safely say that it was a great happiness where that was the case, and with equal sincerity could add that she firmly believed and rejoiced in his domestic comforts. She was not sorry, however, to have the recital of them interrupted by the lady whom they sprang. Poor Charlotte! It was melancholy to leave her such society, but she had chosen it with her eyes open, and though evidently regretting that her visitors were to go, she did not seem to ask for any compassion. Her home and her housekeeping, her parish and her poultry, and all their dependent concerns had not lost their charms. At length the chassis arrived, the trunks were fastened on, the parcels placed within, and it was pronounced to be ready. After an affectionate parting between the friends, Elizabeth was attended to the carriage by Mr. Collins, and as they walked down the garden, he was commissioning her with his best respects to all of her family, not forgetting his thanks for the kindness he had received while at Longbourn in the winter, and his compliments to Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner, though unknown. He then handed her in, and Maria followed, and the door was on the point of being closed when he suddenly reminded them, with the same consternation, that they had hitherto forgotten to leave any message for the ladies at Rosings. But, he added, you will, of course, wish to have your humble respects delivered to them, with your grateful thanks for their kindness to you while you have been here. Elizabeth made no objection. The door was then allowed to be shut, and the carriage drove off. Good gracious, cried Maria after a few minutes' silence. It seems but a day or two since we first came, and yet how many things have happened. A great many, indeed, said her companion with a sigh. We have dined 9 times at Rosings, besides drinking tea there twice. How much I shall have to tell. Elizabeth added privately, and how much I shall have to conceal. Their journey was performed without much conversation or any alarm, and within 4 hours of their leaving Hunsford, they reached Mr. Gardiner's house, where they were to remain a few days. Jane looked well, and Elizabeth had little opportunity of studying her spirits, amidst the various engagements which the kindness of her aunt had reserved for them. But Jane was to go home with her, and at Longbourn there would be leisure enough for observation. It was not without an effort, meanwhile, that she could wait even for Longbourn. She before told her sister of Mr. Darcy's proposals. To know that she had the power of revealing what would so exceedingly astonish Jane, and must, at the same time, so highly gratify whatever of her own vanity she had not yet been able to reason away, was such a temptation to openness as nothing could have conquered but the state of indecision in which she remained in to the extent of what she should communicate. In her fear, if she once entered on the subject, of being hurried into repeating something bigly which might have only grieved her sister further. Chapter 39. It was the 2nd week in May in which the 3 young ladies set out together from Grace Church Street for the town of in Hertfordshire, and as they drew near the appointed inn where Mr. Bennet's carriage was to meet them, they quickly perceived, in token of the coachman's punctuality, both Kitty and Lydia looking out of a dining-room upstairs. The 2 girls had been above an hour in the place, happily employed in visiting an opposite milliner, watching the sentinel on guard, and dressing a salad and a cucumber. After welcoming their sisters, they triumphantly displayed on a table set with such cold meat and an inn larder usual affords, exclaiming, "Is this not nice? Is this not an agreeable surprise?" "And we mean to treat all of you," added Lydia, "but you must lend us the money, for we have just spent ours at the shop out there." Then, showing her purchases, "Look here, I have bought this bonnet. I don't think it is very pretty, but I thought I might as well buy it as not. I shall pull it to pieces as soon as I get home and see if I can make it up any better." And when her sisters abused it as ugly, she added with perfect unconcern, "Oh, but there were 2 or 3 uglier in the shop, and when I have bought some prettier color satin to trim it with fresh, I think it will be very tolerable. I think it will be very tolerable. Besides, it will not much signify what one wears this summer after the Shire has left Merrington, and they are going in a fortnight." "They are indeed," cried Elizabeth with the greatest satisfaction. "They are going to be in camp near Brighton, and I do so want Papa to take us all there for the summer. It would be such a delicious scheme, and I dare say would hardly cost anything at all. Mamma would like to go too, of all things. Only think what a miserable summer else we shall have." Yes, thought Elizabeth, that would be a delightful scheme indeed, and completely due for us at once. Good heaven, Brighton, and a whole camp full of soldiers, to us, who have been overset already by one poor regiment of militia in the monthly balls of Merrington. "Now I have some news for you," said Lydia as they sat down at the table. "What do you think? It is excellent news, capital news, about a certain person we all like." Jane and Elizabeth looked at each other, and the waiter was told he need not stay. Lydia laughed and said, "Aye, that is just like your formality and discretion. You thought the waiter must not hear, as if he cared. I dare say he often hears worse things said than I am going to say. But he is an ugly fellow. I am glad he is gone. I never saw such a long chin in my life. Well, but now for my news. It is about dear Wickham. Too good for the waiter, is it not? There is no danger of Wickham marrying Mary King. There's for you. She is gone down to her uncle at Liverpool, gone to stay. Wickham is safe." "And Mary King is safe," added Elizabeth, "safe from a connection imprudent as to fortune." "She is a great fool for going anyway, if she liked him." "But I hope there is no strong attachment on that side," said Jane. "I am sure there is not on his. I will answer for it. He never cared about 3 straws about her. Who could about such a nasty little freckled thing?" Elizabeth was shocked to think, however incapable of such coarseness of expression herself, the coarseness of sentiment was little other than her own breast harbored and fancied liberal. As soon as all had ate and the elder one paid, the carriage was ordered, and after some contrivance, the whole party, with their boxes, work-bags, and parcels, and the whole unwelcome addition of Kitty and Lydia's purchases, were seated in it. "How nicely we are all crammed in," cried Lydia. "I am glad I brought my bonnet, if it is only for the fun of having another bandbox. Well, now, let us be quite comfortable and snug, and talk and laugh all the way home. And in the first place, let us hear what has happened to you all since you went away. Did you see any pleasant men? Have you had any flirting? I was in great hopes that one of you would have got a husband before you came back. Jane will be quite an old maid soon, I declare. She is almost 23. Lord, how ashamed am I of being not married before 23. My Aunt Phelps wants you to go get husbands. You can't think. She says that Lizzie better had taken Mr. Collins, but I do not think there would have been any fun in it. Lord, how should I like to be married before any of you? And then I would chaperone you all about to the balls. Dear me, we've had such a good piece of fun the other day at Colonel Foster's. Kitty and me were to spend the day there, and Miss Foster promised to have a little dance in the evening. By the by, Mrs. Foster and me are such good friends. And so she asked the two Harringtons to come, but Harriet was ill, and so was Penn was forced to come by herself. And then, what do you think we did? We dressed up the Chamberlain in women's clothes on purpose to pass for a lady, only to think what fun. Not a soul knew of it but Colonel and Mrs. Foster, and Kitty and me, except my aunt, for we were forced to borrow one of her gowns, and you cannot imagine how well he looked. When Denny and Wickham and Pratt and 2 or 3 of the men came in, they did not know him in the least. Lord, how I laughed, and so did Miss Foster. I thought I should have died, and that made the men suspect something, and then they soon found out what was the matter. With such kinds of histories of their parties and good jokes, did Lydia, assisted by Kitty's hints and additions, endure to amuse her companions all the way to Longbourn. Elizabeth listened as little as she could, but there was no escaping the frequent mention of Wickham's name. The reception at home was most kind. Mrs. Bennet rejoiced to see Jane in undiminished beauty, and more than once during dinner did Mr. Bennet voluntarily say to Elizabeth, "I am glad you're back, Lizzie." Their party in the dining room was large, for all of the Lucases came to meet Maria and hear the news, and various were the subjects that occupied them. Lady Lucas was inquiring of Maria after the welcome and poultry of her eldest daughter. Mrs. Bennet was doubtfully engaged, on one hand collecting an account of the present fashions from Jane, who sat some way below her, and on the other retailing them all to the younger Lucases, and Lydia, in a voice rather loud than any other person's, enumerating the various pleasures of the morning to anybody who would hear her. "Oh, Mary," said she, "I wish you would have gone with us, for we had such fun. As we went along, Kitty and I drew up the blinds and pretended there was nobody in the coach, and I should have gone all the way if Kitty had not been sick. And when we got back to George, I do think we behaved very handsomely, for we treated the other 3 with the coldest luncheon in the world, and if you would have gone, we would have treated you too. And then when we came away, it was such fun. I thought we never should have gotten into the coach. I was ready to die of laughter, and then we were so merry all the way home. We talked and laughed so loud that anybody might have heard us 10 miles off." This Mary very gradually replied, "Far be it, my dear sister, to depreciate such pleasures. They would doubtlessly be congenial with the generality of female minds, but I must confess they would have no charms for me. I would certainly prefer a book." But all this answer Lydia heard not a word. She seldom listened to anyone for more than half a minute, and never attended to Mary at all. In the afternoon, Lydia was urgent with the rest of the girls to walk to Merrington, to see how everyone went on. But Elizabeth steadily opposed the scheme. It should not be said that Miss Bennet could not be at home half a day before they were in pursuit of the officers. There was another reason, too, for her opposition. She dreaded seeing Mr. Wickham again, and was resolved to avoid it as long as possible. The comfort to her of the regiment approaching removal was indeed beyond expression. In a fortnight they were to go, and once gone she hoped there could be nothing more to plague her on his account. She had not been many hours at home before she found the Brighton scheme, of which Lydia had given them a hint of the end, was under frequent discussion between her parents. Elizabeth saw directly that her father had not the smallest intention of yielding, but his answers at the time were so vague and equivocal that her mother, though often disheartened, had never yet despaired of succeeding at last.